Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. How powerful is India compared to other states in the Asian region? Has its power increased or decreased over the years? How has COVID-19 epidemic affected India's overall national power? The annual power index launched by the Lowy Institute in 2018, which measures resources and influence of countries to rank the relative power of states in Asia, provides answers to some of these important questions. The project maps the existing distribution of power and tracks shifts in the balance of power over time. The index ranks 26 countries and territories in terms of their capacity to shape their external environment, its scope reaching as far west as Pakistan, as far north as Russia, as far into the Pacific as Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. The 2020 edition, which covers 3 years of data, is the most comprehensive assessment of the changing distribution of power in Asia so far. Among other things, it aims to sharpen the debate on the geopolitical consequences of COVID-19 pandemic. To talk about this index, today I have with me Mr. Herve Lemahieu. He is director of the Asia Power and Diplomacy Program at the Lowy Institute in Sydney. His work analyzes and quantifies shifts in the geoeconomics, military balance, and diplomatic networks of Asia, among other projects. Herve leads the research for the annual Asia Power Index.
Welcome to the National Security Conversations, Mr. Lemahieu.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Congratulations on bringing out the 2020, which I believe is the third edition of the Asia Power Index. It's a fascinating read, and I've sort of read it from page to page. It's absolutely brilliant. So, could you briefly introduce the index for our viewers? What kind of measures and indicators do you use in the study? What is the geographical scope of the study? And more importantly, what is the utility of a study of this kind? I'm fascinated by the study, but I would like you to tell me what you think is the utility of this kind of a study.
Sure, thanks. Look, 3 years ago, we launched this project because we felt there was a need when talking about the changing balance of power within our Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region, to actually seek to quantify in some sense how quickly power dynamics were changing. And on top of that, this is a very academic and sometimes esoteric subject. You know, what is power? And so we define that as the ability of countries to shape their external environment, to react to how the environment shapes them, and to be able to determine the course of regional events as well as shape the decisions made by other state actors and non-state actors. So we take a very comprehensive view of what constitutes power. It's not just hard power. It's not just the size of your economy or the capabilities of your military, but in fact, we look at what countries have in terms of their resources and capabilities, and then perhaps more importantly, we also look at what countries do with what they have in terms of their influence in the region, in terms of the quality and the depth and the number of partnerships that they wield. And so we divide the index across 8 thematic measures of power, core measures of power, everything from economic capability to resilience to economic relationships, defense, diplomacy, and cultural influence. So we go from the spectrum of hard power to the spectrum of soft power. And in terms of geographical scope, in terms of geographical scope, we go as far west as Pakistan. We obviously include India as a very big power in our region. We go as far north as Russia, and as far into the Pacific as Australia and the United States. So this is what you might conceive of as being the Indo-Pacific. We don't perhaps go as far into the Indo-Pacific as India, because India likes to define the extent of the Indo-Pacific as going all the way to the African seaboard, which we don't do Madagascar and all the rest, but we do look at the beating part of the region, and of course within that sits Southeast Asia as well.
Right. I noticed that you include countries and territories. Do you want to say something about that? What is the explanation for that?
Well, all of our, so we have 25 countries and one territory, which is Taiwan. And it's interesting because when we've been to China with this project before as well, and given them the briefing on the results, and there was some question marks around why we included Taiwan when it's not recognized as an official a sovereign state, but we feel it has a role to play within the balance of power. And insofar as the Chinese are looking in Taiwan's direction to understand Taiwan's strengths and weaknesses, we also have to understand that Taiwan plays a role in the region, that it has a relationship with the United States, and that it may well be involved in whatever conflicts that may arise between the US and China. So it's actually critical that we also look at Taiwan.
Interesting. One of the key findings of the report is that COVID-19 has rushed in a new regional disorder in a race to the bottom between Asian powers. Could you explain how COVID-19 has impacted some of the indicators of your study, and which countries have seen some of the greatest gains or losses, as it were, in their ratings due to COVID-19? And more importantly, has COVID-19 upset your own study in any significant manner?
Yes, look, I mean, COVID-19 was a big game changer and methodologically quite challenging for us, because we knew it was going to affect the bottom line for many countries, but data is very hard to come by because it's still a very dynamic situation. And when it comes to making forecasts, because we also look at a series of 10-year forecasts for countries in terms of their GDP growth and their military spending, that also adds a degree of uncertainty, because obviously it depends on how badly affected countries are by the pandemic. So I just wanted to say that the overall basis for the Asian century has been Asia's remarkable economic transformation, from a world economy that was largely dominated by the transatlantic world, by Europe and the United States in 1995, to a world in which 4 of the 5 largest economies globally are in fact in the Asia-Pacific region. This this is really the reason for why we're seeing power and wealth shift eastwards globally. And India is a very big part of that story. So India is very close to being the world's 5th largest economy, and at purchasing power parity, it would already be the 3rd largest economy globally. However, the pandemic has upset the Asian century to quite a large extent. Now, that might be surprising to very many people, because Asia as a whole has managed to deal with the health pandemic more effectively than many other parts of the world. But the economic fallout will be just as pronounced here, and maybe even more so, because of the number of emerging economies, including India, that we have in our region. So whereas last year when we did the index, 17 countries registered upward movements in their relative power. This year, it's been a race to the bottom. So countries have outcompeted each other only by degrees of underperformance, is how we like to say it. When we aggregate all of our indicators, we have about 30,000 data points. This is the constellation of power that we arrive at. And you see that the region is very much dominated by the US and China. But every country that is in a dark blue has registered a downward shift in its relative power over their position last year. So that's 18 countries of the 26 that we cover, including India. And the reason is clearly because of the pandemic, and clearly because of the economic fallout of the pandemic. And of all countries, the United States has been the most affected. It's still the most powerful country. It's still the number 1. But the power differential between the US and China has narrowed by half in 2 years, and in large part due to the loss of US prestige because of its domestic handling of COVID-19 and because of the Trump administration's actions on the world stage. Now, I might just go ahead quickly. This is actually a graph that shows how countries have gained or lost in their reputation as a result of the pandemic. You see that in the bottom left corner, the United States was ranked by a number of regional policymakers and experts as both being the least effective at handling the COVID pandemic, but also as having had the most deterioration in its reputation as a result of its handling. China is another very curious standout here, because whilst it's been ruthlessly effective at dealing with the pandemic, at suppressing the pandemic at home, its reputation has also fallen, partly as a result of not having been forthright in the first instance in terms of the severity of the challenge and communicating that to the world, but also in terms of the rise of wolf warrior diplomacy having soured the relationships with a number of key players, including India, but also Australia. So for a number of reasons, China has suffered diplomatically. So India is ranked 4th overall in terms of its power in our region. It's a very significant player, both as it stands today, but also in terms of its potential. India is obviously the only country that can match China demographically, and that will soon outpace China in terms of its working age population. However, India has suffered the most in relation to its pre-COVID growth trajectory. So whereas last year we had forecast that India would reach about 50% of China's GDP output by the end of the decade, by 2030, our revised forecast suggests that India's economy by the end of the decade will be 13% smaller as sort of a delayed knock-on consequence of the economic fallout of the pandemic. And what that means is that India's rise as a great power in our region has somewhat been delayed as a result of the pandemic and the effect that has on India's economic rise in our region. And you see here a number of countries are obviously affected, but India has had the most pronounced revision in its post-COVID 2030 forecast. On the other hand, India is doing very well in other directions. So we've seen India do incredibly well in terms of being highly networked and externally focused in terms of its defense diplomacy. When we do a network analysis of the number of defense dialogues that take place at a ministerial level in our region, you see that India is very much front and center of a new kind of defense diplomacy. This is not necessarily a defense diplomacy dictated by alliances, but in fact by deepening non-allied partnerships. And the quadrilateral grouping with Japan, Australia, and the United States is a prominent example of that. But it's not the only instance in which India has become more involved in our region. There is also a trilateral bloc that's emerging with Australia and Indonesia with a focus on the Indian Ocean. And in fact, when we look at India's diplomatic influence as a whole, we see that India has surpassed, I might just go here to our website, India has surpassed, or New Delhi has surpassed Moscow and Seoul in South Korea for its diplomatic influence. So I might just look at our map. This is available on our website. It's power.lowyinstitute.org. And what we see is that India has gained 2 places in its diplomatic influence this year, and is ranked 4th overall for its diplomacy. And that, I think, is a sign of increased ambition to play a larger role within the region, and not only within South Asia, but increasingly, look east, act east, Modi's policies towards a broader Indian presence and role within the Indo-Pacific.
Right. Thank you so much. That's very fascinating. The quick question that I have about this particular issue about India's diplomatic influence is that in some ways that is surprising, because we have always felt here in Delhi that India's diplomatic corps is very small. You're talking about under 1,000 diplomats. But your study shows that India's diplomatic influence is not all that, but it's pretty good. So if the personnel is actually very limited, how come the influence is very high? I was wondering.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm still sharing my screen. I'm just going to bring you into what goes into our diplomatic influence measure. There's a number of indicators that we look at. On the one hand, we do look at diplomatic network, so the size of every country's diplomatic network in terms of embassies and in terms of second-tier diplomatic offices like consulates and the rest. So you can actually click into any number of these indicators, and we can have a look at the global standing for India. India has 128 embassies globally. That includes permanent missions to multilateral bodies, including the United Nations. That's a fairly good result, but there are other countries that surpass India in terms of its diplomatic network, including Russia, Japan, US, and China. In fact, China now has more, if you just look at bilateral embassies, China has more bilateral embassies than any other country in the world, including the United States. And that is a new record for China.
Right.
But we also don't just look at diplomatic network, we also look at multilateral power in terms of the number of summits, clubs, and organizations that countries are involved in. We look at their contributions towards multilateral development banks. We look at their voting alignment patterns with other countries to see whether countries are effective at working together to pursue common interests. And we look at foreign policy, and this is actually more of a qualitative survey based on expert input. But we look at, we ask a geographically diverse number of experts to rate how effective countries are at pursuing political and global pursuing regional and global leadership. And when we ask our experts how well India is doing in conducting itself abroad, in its ability to pursue collective interests, India is actually ranked number 3 here for political leadership on the global stage among the countries that we have of our index.
But I have an additional question about methodology, and that is you do take a close look at the resources that a country has and the influence that it has. I was wondering, is there a way that you would also be looking at the perception of countries by others? Power is also about perception. Power is not only about your resources and your ability to influence, but it's also about perception. So, would they say a survey about countries? Would that sort of take care of the perception part of it? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, so we address the perception of power. You're absolutely right that the perception of power is a currency of power in itself. And a lot of so we do have of the 128 indicators, there are a number that deal with qualitative perceptions, and we also look at future resources, so our projections of where countries will stand in 10 years' time. Is in part also to address this question of the perception of power, because it's not just how much power countries are perceived to have today. It's also about their trajectories. If Southeast Asian countries assume that China will continue to rise and that the United States may be in relative decline, that already impacts the way in which they make decisions. So the perception of China's rise, irrespective of whether it eventuates, already has a role to play in China's power today. It's in its ability to make other countries take decisions that really favor Beijing or not. So this is also another way we address the very sort of harder to measure facets of power, which really lie in the eye of the beholder.
Great. Thank you for that explanation. Another key finding of your study is that the United States remains the most powerful country in the region, but registered the largest fall in relative power of any in India Pacific in 2020. So I was wondering, which are the indicators responsible for this fall? What does this mean for stability in the Asian region, as it were? And finally, are we beginning to see the emergence of a post-American world, at least in this part of the world? What's your sense about the US losing its steam, as it were?
Look, I think there's many ways I can address that question, and I'll take you into the granular findings in a minute. But just as an overall framing remark, the elections in the US are very critical in that respect. And not some. It matters because I think if Donald Trump wins a second term, then I think much of the region and much of the world will grow to understand that Trumpism as a political phenomenon is here to stay, and that maybe we are dealing with a post-America America. This is a changed country. Its political character would have fundamentally changed as well. This is not just an aberration of 4 years. And you might agree or disagree with the kind of, America first policies. But the point is that much of the way that America leverages its influence in the region is premised in a post-war rules-based order, functioning or embedded in alliances, and all of these structures is not something that Donald Trump necessarily values very much. So I think we would see a very different kind of America emerge after 4 years of Donald Trump and then another 4 years. If we see a Biden administration, I think it's much more of a resumption back to old patterns of conducting business for America in the region. I don't think we're necessarily going to ever relive the unipolar moments of the United States in the way that it was able to enjoy its power in the 1990s. I think even if Biden wins, the US will have to grow increasingly accustomed to sharing power with China in a sort of uneasy bipolar arrangement. Some form of rivalry will continue. If I take you into the country profile, what you see, though, is that the annual changes across the measures are trending down in all but one of the measures. So I should perhaps begin by just explaining the one measure in which the US has improved, and that is in terms of its resilience. Within resilience, we look at resource security. For the first time in 70 years, the US has become a net energy exporter. Why does that matter? It matters because much of the reason why the US has gotten involved traditionally in wars, particularly in the Middle East, is to do with its dependency on procuring oil from abroad. Much of the vulnerabilities for China's rise, actually stem from its increased dependence on procuring energy from abroad. So this is an enhanced form of resilience for the United States. And if you look at China's picture, you'll see that China is actually becoming more energy dependent, and this presents a long-term vulnerability, and also explains why the rapprochement between Russia and China, because Russia provides that function of catering to China's energy needs. But if you look at every measure, from economic capability to military capability, the military balance of power in Asia is still very much in favor of the United States. However, China is investing in weaponry that could assail US bases and allied bases in the region. China now has the largest navy in the world, if you look at it just in terms of tonnage. The US still has more high-end frigates and amphibious vessels and cruise ships. But if you look at just the net total navy, China now surpasses the US. We've had to make some adjustments to the US's future resources because we estimate that it will take several years for the US to be able to reach pre-COVID levels of economic output. But it's lost the most in terms of its economic relationships and in terms of its diplomatic standing in the region, and it's also lost in terms of cultural influence. So let me just take you into some of these more granular findings. We can break down any of these measures by the subcomponents. So in terms of the trade landscape, China very much dominates. And in fact, the US is the second largest trader in the region, but much of its trade is actually held up in bilateral trade with China, whereas China has a much more diversified set of trade partnerships within our region. If you look at foreign investments, the US is still the largest investor in aggregate terms, even if you look at foreign investment flows over the last 10 years. However, we see an increasingly bifurcated picture. The US invests in countries like Japan, where it's the largest foreign investor, in the United States, and in India as well, in Australia, whereas China does more with less. It tends to invest in smaller countries where it has, sorry about that, sorry, I'm not sure if you're able to see that, where it has, sorry, there we go, where China has an increasingly diversified set of economic partnerships with smaller countries, including Pakistan and Nepal, where it is now the largest foreign investor, and that is also poses a problem for India, not only in terms of India's broader economic relationships with East Asia, but increasingly in India's immediate near abroad. China is a far bigger economic player, and that does pose some interesting questions and choices, I think, for some of India's smaller neighbors, including Nepal in this instance. That's now become that now has China as its primary foreign investor for the first time.
Right, but the big story here really is that the American advantage over China has declined, especially in the wake of the COVID pandemic. I mean, in many ways, that's one big takeaway from what you're saying.
It does seem to be the main takeaway. The areas where China was already ahead, China has increased its lead. And the US is still very dominant in the things that it does well. So in terms of defense networks, alliances, in terms of its soft power, its cultural influence, but certainly in terms of the economics, and then in terms of the perception of power, the perception of US prestige, that is what has set the US back this year, and as a result of the pandemic.
Right. Let me come to the specific finding that you have in the index, which pertains to India. It says that India falls just short of the major power threshold in 2020, and its position as a future peer competitor to China has become less certain. Now, that's a very, very interesting statement right there. And I also noticed that India's score has fallen from 41 points, and 40 is what you need for a major power, in 2019 to 39.7 points in 2020. So it's a marginal decline, but what are some of the factors that are responsible for this fall? And what, in your opinion, from an analytical point of view, would this mean for India's influence in the region? And do you see India recovering some of these lost points in the coming years?
Sure. Yeah, look, it's been a very challenging year, I think, for very many countries, but for India in particular. The health pandemic has obviously been very pronounced in India, at least in recent months, despite, I think, a very proactive initial reaction to the pandemic with a heavy lockdown. What we saw is a kind of a war of attrition where the virus gained ground in later months, and that will have a pronounced impact, not just on the health of Indian society, but also in terms of the economic fundamentals. And it will take several years for India to really recover from that blow. But if I can just mention, you allude to the fact that India lost a number of points. India, if I go into the kind of distribution. This is what the distribution of power looks like, where you have the US and China ahead by a substantial margin. You then have a real, bottom-heavy constellation of minor powers, and then you have what we call the middle powers, and you have a separate strata that's somewhere between superpowers and middle powers. And conventionally, in previous years, that's really been the domain of Japan and India. Now, Japan and India are very different. They are on opposite sides of the Indo-Pacific. One is young, the other is old. One's an advanced economy, the other's a developing economy. They couldn't be more opposites, but insofar as they have opposite strengths and weaknesses, they also offer each other complementarities. And there is a shared understanding that as the US's strategic predominance fades, and as China's ambitions sharpen, that there should be more cooperation between these two Indo-Pacific giants. Unfortunately, what we saw this year is that India fell out of the major power brackets as a result of the economic fallout of the pandemic. So Japan is now the only major power left standing. I don't want to over-dramatize the result, because India is very. If you zoom in on the middle powers, India is a top-performing middle power and is a fraction of a point away from resuming its standing as a major power. But it is indicative of India's predicament, I think. And what it suggests is that it will take several years, really, for India to recover a sustainable footing in the region coming from the pandemic. And it will probably take many more years before we can hope that India graduates from the major power bracket into the superpower bracket. I think that's going to be a multi-decade effort for India to reach that level of competition, of starting to play on a level playing field with China and the United States, and it may not be until the mid-century point. It's not going to be a linear rise. I think we have to understand India's rise on its own terms, and I think we also need to understand that India has strengths, and if you look at India's profile, it has two areas of historically where it's been a bit weaker. Those lie in terms of its economic diplomacy, so its economic relationships and its defense networks. Now, the reason why the defense networks have not been that developed is because, historically speaking, India is, of course, very proudly non-aligned, does not engage in alliances, in mutual defense treaties. But I think in recent years, what we've seen is not necessarily a move towards alliances, but a move towards investing in non-allied partnerships.
More realism.
That's right, exactly. And I think we have seen some significant realignment in the kind of political geography of defense diplomacy, where India is playing a crucial role within the balance of military power, increasingly comfortable to align itself with the United States, with Japan, with Australia. Now, its other weakness is in terms of its economic relationships. Now, this is because India is an empire unto itself. In many ways, if you look at the economic picture, India is still rather inward-looking. It doesn't do very much outward investment. It's not a big trade player, certainly not in Southeast Asia. And what we've seen is that India has actually registered some points gains in its defense networks, but it's moving backwards in terms of economic relationships. So in that regard, the withdrawal from the regional comprehensive economic partnership has been damaging for India's economic standing in the region.
But Herve, now, so this is now in many ways not looking great. I mean, on the one hand, you have the American advantage over China declining in the wake of the COVID pandemic. On the other hand, you are saying that while India is the only country with the demographic scale to match China, expectations that it can begin to level with China in coming years is unrealistic. And then you go on to say that the only major power left standing in Asia is an overachiever. which is Japan, one that is in a long-term decline. So what is the implication? Are you saying that China will dictate Asia pretty soon? Is that your conclusion?
No, and I think we have to understand, yes, it's been a terrible year for all the actors involved. It's not been a great year for China either. And in fact, their power has stalled, so it's unchanged from last year. And so I do want to dispute this kind of narrative that which the Chinese themselves love to promote, which is of the inexorable rise of China. China has pronounced strengths. We know where those lie. They lie in its economic advantages, the vitality of its and the size of its economy, its trade partnerships. But it's remarkable that China has not been able to capitalize from the pandemic, given how bad the pandemic has been for the United States. In fact, China has really scored a number of own goals in terms of choosing to fight multiple diplomatic spats at once with a number of countries, including India. And in India's case, that's actually resulted in physical, kinetic border skirmishes. So it's not just a war of words, but a physical conflict as well. And if you consider the fact that China is surrounded by neighbors, 11 of whom have boundary disputes and/or legacies of interstate conflict with China. And that really poisons the well of trust that neighbors have for China. I would say that we have as a whole, we have a region that's really on edge, that's increasingly wary of the implications of China's rise, that is unclear about China's ambitions and just how far it's willing to pursue that and push the status quo and perhaps even challenge the rules-based order. So I think China will find it very difficult to create a Sino-centric regional order simply because the region at large is unwilling to accept that. The more likely scenario is an uneasy bipolar relationship with the United States, and in fact, what I would call an asymmetric multipolarity. That is to say, a number of countries, whilst much less powerful than China, nevertheless will be consequential in determining, in limiting China's rise.
God, I just wanted to come to that actually. You discuss a lot about the middle powers, and you talk about Vietnam, Australia, and Taiwan are the only countries to gain relative power in 2020. So, so in this context, in sort of standing up to China, for instance, what role do you foresee, or do you expect to be played by Vietnam, Australia, and Taiwan, based on your findings so far?
Yes, I think it's interesting. It's quite remarkable that whilst all the giants in our region, India, Japan, US, and China, have either suffered setbacks. Well, they've all suffered setbacks and have all either registered downfalls in their power or have stalled. I mean, they've remained unchanged. The three countries and territories, I should say, with Taiwan, the three actors that registered improvements in their relative power this year have all been middle powers. And for very different reasons, and each one of them is actually quite different. So from a very low base, you have Taiwan. It's not ranked particularly highly. It's incredibly vulnerable in relation to China, both its geographical proximity, but obviously the contested nature of Taiwan's existence also poses a real existential long-term threat for Taiwan. On the other hand, we've seen Taiwan really enhance its reputation this year in particular with the very effective handling of the pandemic. We've seen Taiwan diversify its economic relationships away from China, and in that sense, its de facto unofficial foreign policy network has been very effective and is ranked the 10th most effective foreign policy bureaucracy within the region, even though it's not even kind of officially recognized as such. Then we have Vietnam, and Vietnam has now overtaken New Zealand as the 12th most powerful country in our region. It's 1 point shy of reaching Indonesia, a much bigger country, Indonesia's power. And Vietnam is remarkable in that it's become a far more adept multilateral player. You can see that in terms of how savvy it's become in its rapprochement with the United States, historical enemy, bitter former enemy, but also more importantly in terms of the way that it has steered multilateral trade initiatives, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, as the chair of ASEAN. It's also been involved in the resuscitation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, minus America. It's also a savvy player in that even though it has a contested maritime boundary with China, it still maintains interesting party-to-party ties. I mean, between Hanoi and Beijing, you still have a very robust relationship between both communist parties. So it's a very savvy player within our region, and its rise has been pronounced. Now, next comes Australia, and Australia's replaced South Korea as the 6th most powerful country within the Indo-Pacific. That's quite striking, especially for us in Australia, because we tend to have a very high threat perception and low view of our own power. What's driven the result for Australia in particular is both the fact that we have invested proactively in our economic relationships, with free trade agreements with Indonesia and multilaterally as well with ASEAN. But then also in terms of our defense diplomacy, we've really led the way in terms of the variable geometry arrangements, bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral, quad plus even in the region. And that has meant that we are actually ranked ahead of the United States in our non-allied defense diplomacy. So we're a more nimble player, especially in Southeast Asia. We carry less of our baggage.
Well, but put together these 3 countries, you think they will play a major role in sort of in the geopolitical order in the Asian region? Is that where you're getting at? Because that sounds like a very interesting proposition.
I think so. I think it may not be exactly Taiwan, Australia, and Vietnam, but I think middle powers as a whole have a more consequential role to play and will make the marginal difference in the balance of power, particularly in a region where neither the United States nor China can claim primacy. If you have both those giants gridlocked in a uneasy balance of power, then smaller players like middle powers such as Australia, such as Vietnam, will become more important.
Wonderful. Here is my final question. One of the fascinating elements of this index, I thought, was the concept of power gap. Could you explain the concept of power gap in some detail to our viewers? And you sort of classify countries as overachievers and underachievers. And I see that India has been placed in the underachiever category. So what is this concept of the power gap?
Yes, the power gap, I'm very pleased, by the way, to the extent to which you've engaged with our methodology. I will just go back to the screen share and show you what we mean by the power gap. So irrespective of where countries place in our ranking, the fact is that the aggregate measure of power, the comprehensive power, is a function of 2 things. What countries have in terms of their size, their resources, their capabilities, whether that's military or economic, and what countries do with what they have in terms of their influence. So the influence-based determinants of power versus the resource-based determinants of power is what we're looking at in the power gap. So the idea is that if you look at Japan, its comprehensive power is rooted much more in terms of its influence than it is in terms of its military strength, for example. I mean, Japan is not a very powerful military. It's a self-defense force that since the Second World War has been very limited in what it can do. So Japan is a net overachiever in relation to its size and resources. And we run a regression model. So we have a model that tells you more or less where we would expect countries to stand in terms of their overall power. We would think that normally Japan would be somewhere along that line, but the fact that it's so far up ahead suggests that it is actually very effective at using its limited resources to produce broad-based influence within our region, whether that's economic, cultural, or diplomatic. A number of the other advanced middle powers, such as Australia, South Korea, and Singapore, also are overachievers. Now, this implies that they are highly networked, that they're externally focused, and that they can pursue their interests collectively. That's easier done when you're Singapore, because you're a city-state of 5.6 million people. So it's more or less, you have more bandwidth as a policymaker in Singapore to focus your priorities on foreign policy. Now, if you're India, you see there, you're just underneath the line, the trend line, so that in aggregate terms, India is an underachiever. Not so far as Russia, though. I mean, Russia is truly a misfit middle power within our region. And I think the fact that it's on the geographic periphery of Asia probably limits its influence, but also its priorities are elsewhere. They're in the Middle East, they're in Europe, they're not necessarily in Asia. But I think a lot of developing countries, such as India, are still restricted. Their potential is restricted by the fact that they are more preoccupied by domestic challenges than they are by foreign policy challenges. And that suggests to us, I mean, it's both good news and bad news. The bad news is that India underachieves in relation to its potential, so in relation to its size and resources. But the good news is that there is the potential to do better. And that if India continues to show ambition in the way that it has in recent years, because it's improved its power gap score, that much of the gains made in India's standing in the region will not just emerge from its size, from its scale, but also from the quality and the depth of its partnerships, from the influences that it can wield within the region. So that is an area of unfulfilled potential.
So China seems to be exactly where it should be, right? On the line.
Yes, it's interesting. When we started this exercise in 2018, the United States was a overachiever, and that was a legacy, I think, also of the Obama years. I mean, Obama left a very contested legacy within our region. There's a lot of criticism as well that he was not willing to assert himself more robustly in relation to what China was doing in the South China Sea. Be that as it may, U.S. standing in terms of economic, cultural, and diplomatic influence was higher than it is today. And today it is lower. So today the US is an underachiever, and that's particularly concerning given that if it wants to compete effectively with China, its comparative advantages really lie in its network power, in its influence, and in the quality of its partnerships. China, on the other hand, is still an underachiever, but it's getting very close to that line. And it's interesting because it shows two things that are working in opposite directions. On the one hand, when it comes to high-level politics, China has lost diplomatic influence as a result of the choices that it has made and the rise of a sort of more belligerent tone in terms of its will for diplomacy. But if you look at China's cultural influence, it has gained in aggregate. What do we mean by cultural influence? You could call it soft power. It is that you now have, for example, 58 million travelers from the Indo-Pacific that go to China every year. China is a much more pervasive presence in the everyday lives of most people who live in this region. And insofar as people engage with China economically, they also engage with it culturally. And so China is getting better, basically, at translating its resources into influence. It's not an overachiever. It's still a marginal underachiever, but it does seem to be becoming a bit more savvy in the way that it operates within our region.
Fascinating insights. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Herve, and congratulations once again for bringing out this fantastic third edition of Asia Power Index.
Thank you for your interest, and I really enjoyed your line of questioning.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.